To the curious, the seekers, and also the experts, welcome. You are listening to Poli-Psych podcast. This week we are discussing Charlottesville, and we have with us our MBTI specialist, Ken, who also happened to be at Charlottesville and has some very definite opinions about what was happening there and great information to back it up. So welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Cindy.
And we also have with us Don, who is our Enneagram specialist. And welcome, Don.
Thank you, Cindy.
And we will begin. Ken has created an outline for us, and it really has been studying this issue. So Ken, would you like to begin?
Sure, I would love to. It was a sad event. I was there the week after the actual riot itself, which took place during what we call the Unite the Right rally on August 11th and 12th, 2017. And the event itself has never really gone away for various reasons that we'll be studying today. The purpose of today's podcast is really to break down the conceptual backdrop for these events, how they morphed into a political football, and we'll also take a look at the downside. There was a lot of suffering that came out of this event, both for the families of the three people who were fatalities, casualties, and a vast number of people who were injured. The backdrop begins with the Charleston, South Carolina church shooting in 2015, which ignited the linkage between monuments and virulent, violent prejudice. The shooter was a horrific individual. He basically executed 8 people inside a church. It's not vastly different from the event that just took place in New Zealand. The individual published numerous writings and so on detailing his views, a manifesto, and was never, ever sorry for his actions. And it ignited two things really that stayed with us through the Charlottesville event, and those were the monument issues in the South and also the Confederate flag. Both symbols were used as symbols of racism, and rightly so from certain perspectives, but they became actually co-opted archetypes that then became really a political football. So we look at, from an MBTI perspective, the second category of perception, where you have sense data and you have intuition. And what we're doing here as we move through the show, we'll be looking at how those linkages were very skillfully manipulated at times to influence the population, to create disturbance in the population, sometimes and most of the time for the right reasons. But it was definitely at times taken advantage of by people that we'll be discussing next. The history of Richard Spencer is very troublesome. He's recognized as an American white supremacist. He's president of an organization known as the National Policy Institute, which actually was created and actually was the spawn for the term alt-right, which was presented as a view of white identity being the most important aspect of their political attachment. And it, of course, stood in contradistinction to our usual non-racist mentality. I think we're almost uniformly against racism. And this was kind of a noxious influence on the political front. This individual, Richard Spencer, would give Nazi salutes. He actually did do a Nazi salute at a Milo Yiannopoulos event. Milo is Jewish, so it was very dissonant, very hurtful, really. It just rubbed people the wrong way. And his job really is to rub people the wrong way. And the most significant takeaway from this is the creation of the term alt-right. He's solely responsible for that. And again, that's probably the third conceptual takeaway, is that term now becomes also a cultural archetype which can be pasted on to other people who aren't even related to these beliefs, this racism, the Nazi ideology. These are all things that Richard Spencer openly talks about. The background also is similar to that of Jason Kessler, who was the actual organizer of the what we're now calling the Unite the Right March. And they share a common background in the University of Virginia, which is the educational institution and probably the largest employer in the Charlottesville area. And they share that background. They both were political science or psychology majors, and they seem to be fairly well entrenched in the Northern Virginia area in both the influencing community. I uncovered some pretty interesting background on Richard Spencer's original National Policy Institute head was a gentleman named Lewis Andrews, who was an Obama supporter. And as Don points out, there is evidence that both of these people were at times completely supportive of the opposite side of the political spectrum, which is it raises some issues as far as the character itself and just the plausibility of making that kind of a conversion from one end of the political spectrum to the other, which opens the door to the possibility that these people are, in show business terms, doing material. They don't really believe in the cause as much as other motivations, such as making a living or perhaps serving at the behest of other players in the political arena, maintaining status as a sort of sleeper cell that could be used to affect outcomes of other events like Charlottesville. And Don, I just wanted to see so far what you've gathered too, as you've come in contact with this information, and you've no doubt been watching this too, just like we all have, kind of on the sidelines as we've gone through the election cycle in 2016 and beyond.
Yeah, the memories are coming back of that time, over a year ago, and it was a disturbing event. And there's a few things I remember about the players involved. And one of the first things I do want to point out is, just in case people want to look up Richard Spencer, don't get him confused with Robert Spencer, two very different people with very different ideas. So just get that out of the way. They're often confused on Twitter, and Robert Spencer often has to beat off the people that think that he's Richard Spencer, and he's not. The other thing that comes to mind is Jason Kessler's background. I do remember him cozying up to people like Alex Jones, I believe, before the event actually happened. And if memory serves, and of course those YouTube clips of the Alex Jones show aren't available anymore because of the censorship against Alex Jones. But in retrospect, it became clear following those interviews that that Jason Kessler was actually playing a role, as you said, and that came out also in various articles at the time, leading many people to believe that this was some kind of a setup. So, he did have he did come on Alex Jones, if memory serves, and say, yeah, I used to be a leftist, but now I'm on your side. And so the red flags go up and say, well, wait a minute, why are you on my side? And he starts talking about things that actually cause racial division. And of course, that's the last thing that any liberty-minded person like Alex Jones wants to be associated with and is often accused of being. So it really looks like there are all the symptoms of a provocateur event by some people that they were basically told to act a role, and we don't know who was pulling the strings.
And some interesting details about Kessler. He had worked for Seacrest Strategic Services, and the last two words are interesting, strategic services. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, became our CIA. So the operative term for this sort of work, political influencing, it really is it's considered a strategic service as opposed to a strategic, military solution. They would go in more for the cognitive solution. And also, the interesting thing about Spencer is not only that, but he had also, and actually it was Jason Kessler, I believe, that had at one time submitted articles for, I think was not Breitbart, but the other Daily Caller. And he seems to be pretty good at sneaking in the door. And we'll go back to the slide, Cindy, if we could look at the one, number 5, is really interesting. That's Jason Kessler below the bear. His hair is a little longer. He looks a little less, just looks a little different than his visual presentation at the Charlottesville event. But here he is with Congressman or Representative Tom Garrett, and you can see in the upper right, it's kind of detailed, but they had this sort of cover story as to how they got into the office using another pretext about a group called the Raise Act and Stop Arming Terrorists Act or something like that. So I think the point was to get that photo op, and Garrett then later ends up making kind of an interesting admission that which I typed in there I had copied in at the bottom. Tom Garrett has stated that racial divisions fomented by Russian agents contributed to violence at the rally, which strikes me as nonsensical, but I guess we'll see by the end of the show if that holds water. And up one slide from there, Cindy, going back to 4. This is a very common technique in influencing. So we have Jason Kessler becoming a public archetype. We have the Make America Great Again hat, which is also a public archetype. So he's trying to co-opt that symbol. And it's one of the downsides of using MAGA hats. I have kind of come to look at them as maybe not the best strategy in the world, because you can put the hat on anything and link it to anything. And here we have the downside exposed. And here's Kessler with the American flag and the MAGA hat, and we're still getting that same sort of subconscious programming through the media. And it may go back to this. Yeah, go. Sure.
Oh, just
what do you think?
Friend of mine told me a story of a recent experience. He went into town in a very, I would say, left-wing area, and he was wearing a MAGA hat, but he was also wearing a tie-dye shirt, and he got some unusual reactions.
Well, yeah, the mixing. I remember there was a scene in one of the Kubrick films, the one about Vietnam, where he had a peace sign and then "Born to Kill" or something like that on his helmet. So it's something
along
you can
those
make.
lines, yeah.
Yeah, it's just using that's kind of a comedic version of it, but it's still the same archetypal, sensing, intuition, letter number 2 in the MBTI. And there's interplay between that and the perceiving function, between the sense, the actual hard object, and then the story behind it. And that's kind of the what Jung would say is the intuitive end of it. The archetypes are somewhat intoxicating. All that Nazi regalia that these people roll out, that all has an effect. It may intoxicate themselves, and there are real Nazis out there. I'm not denying that, but this guy is like the Pied Piper, in my opinion. So far, the jury's still out. Let's go up on one slide, Cindy, to number 3. And I want to pause on this picture for a second, because here we have, this actually is an event that occurred before the main event at Charlottesville. It occurred in May of 2017. And I believe it was a test case. Now, if you take a really hard look into the background, you can see the Lee statue I was there, like I said, the week after, and I know that park pretty well, and I was right there looking at the statue the week after this whole thing went down. And we'll probably do that in another show. I'll share more pictures and just other reflections on what that was like. But they were co-opting the Confederate statue. So here we have a torchlight, the symbol of the Nazi torchlight parades, now also a cultural archetype, and they're molding that. They're bringing these two pieces of sense data together in an intuitive linkage, and they've now co-opted the monument issue. So that's a really significant thing moving into and we'll get to Donald Trump's press conference near the end of the show, and in the not too distant future, we'll probably be there in about 15 minutes or so. But we do want to give these reflections. And Don, is there any Enneagram linkage, or even in your MBTI knowledge is pretty extensive as well? What do you think about the linkages that they're setting up here?
Well, there is a whole crowd psychology thing, which is much stronger in some Enneagram types than in others. And you really can use the Enneagram as a tool not only for individual personality type, but also understanding dynamics of persuasion. And if you remember the movie "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," there is the Klan scene, and that also does take place at night, at least part of it. And that is an echo of the Enneagram 6 in Ulysses, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So, yeah, I see a very scary mob darkness psychology at work. And of course, that's the downside of the Enneagram 6. All of the Enneagram types have a downside and an upside, but that characterization of the paranoia that is associated with the Klan and the xenophobia also associated with the Klan is Enneagram 6 stereotypically downside. And almost anybody that's aware of the Enneagram knows that both the downsides and the upsides of each type. So by saying that, I'm not saying anything against anybody that would be Enneagram type 6 self described or otherwise. So that's my reading on that.
Great. So moving on to kind of on a timeline perspective. So this is May 13th, 2017. There was a small KKK rally which followed the usual pattern most of these did follow before this happened. On July 8th, the KKK turned out 50 people, and there were 1,000 counter demonstrators yelling at them, which is the typical setup. And the background on this is Jason Kessler begins to organize in a different way. And I don't think he was strongly tied in with the KKK. He started basically recruiting from all over the US, all these sort of splinter groups. And he called this Unite the Right, which is another co-opting of the term right. Right could be, the 85-year-old lady you sit next to in church. Is somebody who's just not, they're maybe a little more conservative as opposed to left. These sides normally cooperate just fine socially. But tying that into alt-right and then unite the right, and it's really a ridiculous concept. The right is not united. It never has been. Most of the ethos of the right is just, either less government or self-determination, just something, economic cooperation. Uniting the right is just a silly idea on the surface, but it's actually a very skillful political dirtying up. Once again, Kessler's technique of mixing archetypes and doing that to provide a lever.
When you say those words, I picture goose stepping.
Well, yeah, it's a cultural archetype, and it's unfortunate. Now we can see through that, but not everybody can. I mean, if you're predetermined, if you've already got kind of if you don't like Donald Trump already, you're going to these are very intoxicating pictures. They would reinforce your predetermined like or dislike of an individual. And the movement, as it went through the permitting process, it went back and forth. There were a number of twists and turns in that process that I'll kind of skip over. But I do want to jump. Now, this is on the Kessler side. On the right, it's, for lack of a better term at this point, Kessler and Spencer most likely, and you see all the microphones. This is an interesting picture. If you look at, that's Jason Kessler. Look at the mic bank on the right and the amount of work that went into that. Look at the cameramen in the background. This guy is getting a lot of attention, and it's curious that he is. He's a professional operator. That evidently they knew where he was going to stand. They took the time to set up. We've both worked with sound equipment, and that's a pretty big mic bank to actually stand. He's to sound check the whole thing. So this is carefully choreographed for an effect that I think we'll see unfold. I do want to jump to the other end of the spectrum and look at, Cindy, if you could put up the landing page for Crowds on Demand. And we're just going to take a look at their landing page just to familiarize people with this industry. And these are event stagers. This is a really interesting read. We won't read the whole thing, but this is a company that actually makes things happen by arranging stunts or political events. You can see the fairly self-explanatory. And then Cindy, if you could scroll down a little bit, and you can see they go into considerable detail about their ways of influencing, their reach. And it's fascinating that this is still up, and we'll see why we directed your attention to this on the next slide, which is an ad that appeared at about the same time of the Charlottesville riot and the Charlottesville demonstrations. And it was a Craigslist ad that was discovered just after the fatalities. And it shows, now Charlotte is in North Carolina, but it's not far away. It's a bus ride, about probably a 4-hour bus ride from Charlotte. Charlotte is a major air hub on the East Coast, as most people know over here. And it would be a really good rallying point. The next slide we have is an ad that appeared in Craigslist in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is about 4 hours away from Charlottesville, Virginia. And it refers back to the Crowds on Demand website, same company. It's an interesting view as to how they actually recruit. It looks kind of bland, but I would direct everyone's attention to the very last line. It's an interesting comment, and they say at the bottom, "Are you okay with participating in peaceful protests? Optional," which is interesting. So there's a possibility that some of the Antifa swarms that were definitely attending a lot of the Donald Trump rallies and some of the other events could have been organized and financed through a firm of this type. Their description seems to meet that criteria. So the working theory is possibly that the Antifa, or what we would call the left side of the spectrum, the extremists on the other side, were coming through this conduit. And we'll move into the actual event itself fairly soon. We get closer and closer to the day. The actual, what we call the Charlottesville riot, occurred on 2 days, Friday and a Saturday. The August 11th was the scene of the Tiki Torch Parade, which we'll see in the next slide. And this is sort of that iconic image that we've seen all the time in the news. And I don't know what everybody's level of credibility this would have, but these do look like a mixture of real Nazis. But it's just something about this always struck me as being a little too slick, a little too well positioned. We have the building in the background, and the intent was to create a photo op. And normally with that kind of motivation, there's got to be a little more direction on the scene to make that happen. But who knows? That's just a speculation. What do you think, Don, of this whole setup?
Yeah, it's over the top. I knew when this happened, I said, either these people are idiots or this is a setup. So, I think it went in the direction of being a setup, and then these were actors. But it's one or the other. Nobody is this stupid to go out and act so stereotypically, and actually think that this is a good thing.
Yeah, the origin of the company that assembled this, possibly they are based in Hollywood, so the photographic presentation skills would be at a little higher level. But there's something different about this, and I've never quite gotten my finger on it. And who knows? Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. But it's just naturally it has an intended effect of disturbing people, and people should really ask that when they watch television and they feel extremely disturbed, is to also look at that critically and think, why am I feeling this way? Why is the intent there to do this? Sometimes it's for entertainment. It could just be people watch more television, but it could be all of the above, plus to kind of guide the political conclusion in a certain way. And moving on, yeah, go ahead, Don, if you have a comment on that.
Oh, it just makes you wonder where the pitchforks are. It's like, okay, there's some torches there, I see them, but where are the pitchforks? I'm sure there must be some there somewhere.
Yeah, well, this is so primal. It's so it looks uncivilized, and it's not really. But I think that we're also, not only are we, do they play with people's emotions and staging, if indeed this was staged, in presenting this kind of an image, but we've actually been trained through watching movies and television shows to react to something like this, because in encapsulating ideas and emotions, TV shows and movies have made this kind of thing iconic. So it raises all kinds of other images that we've seen that are similar, that are scary and threatening.
Including, I wonder if Gene Wilder is going to poke his head out of there, and it's going to be walk this way, and we wonder why the natives are restless. It looks like something out of Young Frankenstein.
Well, and I think there's probably a full spectrum of participation, and the sad thing is there are young people that are impressionable enough to fall right into this and adopt it, and they feel that intoxication of the archetypal primal thing, and unfortunately, sadly, it resulted in the death of Heather Heyer. The person who was responsible for that death was not an actor. He was a misguided youth, and nobody was there to guide him. And the people that did guide him were people like Jason Kessler and Richard Spencer. And that's why I'll always come back to that when they talk about Donald Trump's reaction, is he was wrestling with the same concept, I think, is just to figure out what is going on here. Who are these people, and who's behind this, and why are they misleading people into this hateful ideology? And how this march went, they marched in a most horrific part of the whole thing. Unite the Right didn't ever take place. This was a preamble. This was not on the schedule. It was probably a surprise attack engineered by Jason Kessler. And what they did is they moved from Lee Park, where the monument was, and they went over to the UVA campus, which brings us to the next slide. And they went after another archetype. And this is a tough one. This is Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. It's a statue of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had slaves, and again, they're seizing. They've captured another icon, and they've captured a difficult issue: the fact that Thomas Jefferson did own slaves. And it's serving as a wedge to conservatism in general, and just kind of just a political disturbance. And we have, if you look at the picture closely, you'll see there's a ring of people protecting the statue, and they're surrounded in a threatening manner by the Torchlight people. Torchlight going back to either Kristallnacht or one of the Nazi marches. I think the Nazis had candlelight or torchlight marches. And actually, interestingly, if you look up the history of the Nazis in Ukraine during the very suspect political developments there was they used tiki torches in Ukraine. I decided not to put that picture on here. It was just not really related to this topic, but who knows? I mean, maybe it's just something that people arrive at by figuring out how to do torches, but the concept, obviously, it's a very effective photo op, as well as very negative image. I have trouble looking at it. I think anybody would, but it's there for a reason. This is too perfect. This setup right here is very well organized. You see the even spacing around the statue, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say about it anymore, but it's there for a reason. In my opinion, it's my feeling. What do you think, Don and Cindy?
Well, I think we need to recognize that one of the main things that happen, one of the things that happens in history when you have historical leaders called into question is there's an attempt to rewrite history. And Donald Trump made his statement, made a statement to that effect in his reaction, which had to do with, well, are you going to tear down statues of George Washington? He owned slaves too. And it's valuable to leave the historical markers there and to work through as a society the process of recognizing that your leaders, your founders, weren't perfect people, and they lived in times that weren't perfect. And actually, the historical truth about Jefferson is that he tried to get the slavery outlawed before America actually accepted the Constitution. But the time wasn't yet. People weren't ready for it. The economy wasn't ready for it. So it's really, I think we have to recognize that it's just a political tactic to get people to hate leaders that actually were hoping that one day America would get rid of slavery, but that they owned slaves because that was what was necessary at the time in order to live on a large estate and in order to survive. And then there's the assumption that all the white people own slaves, which of course is also equally false. So there's a lot of false history that is promoted when you get this false outrage that is really looking like a propaganda event.
And moving into day 2, which would be Saturday, we have a very chaotic situation taking shape, and eventually the skirmishes broke out, and the rally was scheduled to begin at noon, and it never did begin. So Unite the Right never, technically, at least the scheduled portions of it, never took place, and it sort of deteriorated into the rumbles that we'll see depicted on YouTube. And I wanted to just play that clip from Cornell West. We're going to have an interesting counterattack take place, and very lethal. And we're going to study that just for a second here.
Very important to keep in mind, because the police, for the most part, pulled back. The next day, for example, although the 20 of us who were standing, many of them clergy, we would have been crushed like cockroaches if it were not for the anarchists and the anti-fascists who approached over 350 anti-fascists. We just had 20, and we singing This Little Light of Mine. You know what I mean? So that
Antifa meaning anti-fascists.
The anti-fascists, and the crucial role of the anarchists, because they saved our lives, actually. We would have been completely crushed, and I'll never forget that. Meaning what? Meaning that you had the police holding back on the one hand. So we couldn't even get arrested. We were there to get arrested. We couldn't get arrested because the police had pulled back and just allowing fellow citizens to go at each other, you see. And with all of the consequences that would follow therefrom. So in that sense, I think what we're really seeing, though, Sister Amy, is The American empire in decay with the rule of big money, with massive militarism, facilitated by the scapegoating of the most vulnerable of immigrants, Muslims, Jews, Arabs, gay, lesbians, trans, and bisexuals, and black folk. The white supremacy was so intense. I'd never seen that kind of hatred in my life. We stood there, and 9 units went by and looking right in our eyes, and they cussing me out and so forth and so on. And they lucky I didn't lose my Holy Ghost, to tell you the truth, because I wanted to start swinging myself. I'm a Christian, but not a pacifist, you know. But I held back. But that kind of hatred, but that is just the theater. It's big money, it's big military, and the way in which this capitalist civilization is leading us toward unbelievable darkness and bleakness. And the beautiful thing is to fight back.
This clip struck me as being kind of a pretext or setup, just based on some of the little clues. He seemed to have a very good head count, 250 Antifa. And what's going on here at this point in time, what he's describing is the early or late morning time frame, probably between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. And the Antifa actually arrived at right around 11 a.m. on buses. There were at least 3 large buses that unloaded them. And we'll play another clip in a little while of a witness to that process. And it was very violent. They came very well armed, and simultaneously the police pulled back. The state of emergency was declared by Governor McAuliffe, and this just unleashed mayhem, even worse than they had before. They had been keeping people sort of self-contained in a structural pen. I don't know if we have a aerial map of that, where Cindy's showing us the Antifa themselves. This is the aerial view of the earlier part of the morning when the police had barricades, but they were intermingling the protesters and the counter demonstrators. Protesters meaning the white nationalists, and then the counter demonstrators. And there's, of course, we've seen some of the video. It's hard to watch. We're not going to play it here, but it just got out of hand. And eventually when the police pulled back, we also had another very important aspect, are the militia who kind of came in. Militia meaning I think there was one from Pennsylvania, one from New York, and in Virginia is an open carry state. And all the Second Amendment stuff aside, I think firearms are about the worst thing you can have in a crowd. It's not the right tool for the job, number one, and there's just the possibility bullets, even from low caliber, can go hundreds of yards and do lethal damage. And I'm not really comfortable with that even being a possibility. And that's why I'm kind of surprised that somebody like Jason Kessler, this is proof that Jason Kessler and Richard Spencer have absolutely no concern for humanity. Starting a conflict like this, or encouraging a conflict like this, and then bringing firearms into that, is just asking for trouble. And you could be cynical and look at this and say, well, maybe it was a setup to try to encourage that to happen, to give another pretext to suddenly clamp down on lawful Second Amendment. It was just irresponsible for people to be carrying high-powered ARs and so on in a crowded area. It's just not the right thing to do. But what do you think, Don?
Well, I might be categorized as cynical, but I do tend to look at this whole event as being orchestrated. And what do the orchestrated events intend to have happen after the event? And I think, any kind of outrage that would require government to intervene is something that you have to consider was actually part of the original intent. If it flowed naturally out of this, then maybe that was what was intended. And one of the things I wanted to mention earlier also is that at this time, the time that this event occurred, there was this whole focus on the term alt-right, and there were a number of people that would be considered, might have been considered new right, and were by some people, and that said, no, I'm not alt-right, in deliberate attempt to distance themselves or to disavow the leadership of this event, Jason Kessler and Richard Spencer, and not to be associated with the alt-right. So they said things like, well, okay, we're the new right, we're whatever we are, we like memes and having fun on the internet and poking fun at our enemies, but we're not into any kind of violent confrontations. So that was another outcome of this that is sort of how I saw it all, sorting itself out. The event, I think, was actually a little bit over the top in terms of the propaganda manipulation aspect of it, to the extent that people that thought that they might want to side with Jason Kessler, etc., before the event ended up deciding to not associate with him in the future. So it actually, rather than showing people that actually followed the whole event, rather than making them want to say white supremacy is a problem in America, they would tend to say, look at this minority of kooks there, and the vast majority of people said, we don't want to have anything to do with this.
Yeah, it's just the damage was done. It's taken, here we're still talking about it, and it's a year and coming up on 2 years. And in a way, both these people, Spencer and Kessler, are kamikaze hitmen, and they know they're going to get hit, and they must be making money doing it, or they must, for whatever motivation they have. There are lots of people that won't get to that point. We can reflect upon it, and it's taken us this long, but usually he who has to explain is at a disadvantage. And I hope it works itself out. But I think we lost the midterms, or not we as in the collective right lost the midterms. And I am a supporter of Donald Trump, full disclosure, not unqualified. I don't idolize him. I don't think anybody here would idolize any human being. But just seeing the level of negative attachment that came from this event, it's started with this sort of line of thinking. The next phase we'll move into. I'd like to play the clip, though, if we could, of the actual Antifa attack. It's a very interesting interview that people should probably listen to. It's a eyewitness in Charlottesville who rings credibly to me, just from being there talking to other people. And we're going to pick it up at right at the point when the Antifa attack storms through a restaurant near the park.
Now, when it popped off, when everybody disembarked the buses, what happened then?
Well, there was a couple of the men in the restaurant that kind of led us all back to the back door,
right,
which led into the alley. And a lot of us had parked there in the alley, but there was probably about, I want to say, 20, 30 of us.
Y'all went out the back door of the restaurant?
Yeah, we went out the back door because the people from the buses were coming from the front, and they weren't walking, they weren't skipping, they were full on running and screaming.
Damn.
And throwing things. I mean, they came off the bus angry.
So what were they throwing?
And wrecked the damage.
Throwing?
Sorry?
What do you mean? What were they throwing? Throwing what? Throwing? What do you mean?
Well, the one that almost got me and the few people around me it was like a 20-ounce Sprite bottle that had concrete in it. Like, I've never,
that's some crazy,
they're
that's some
throwing
crazy
everything
stuff.
they can get their hands on. They had like condoms and balloons filled with, I don't know if it was horse manure, which is very common around here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Wait a minute, they had condoms and balloons with feces in it?
It was filled with crap.
Feces,
and
well,
I don't know what else, but I know it stunk like nothing I'd ever
so
smelled.
somebody was carrying around 20-ounce bottles of Sprite with concrete in it and feces getting off the bus. And feces and balloons.
Pepper spray and maze. The people that were sitting next to me in the restaurant was the sweetest old man. he was there having lunch with his granddaughter, his great-granddaughter, who was 7, and she was so in love with her grandpa. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
when we were going out the back of the restaurant, Van was trying really hard to keep his granddaughter from seeing what was going on, because it all happened so fast. We didn't have time to think or react or nothing.
Yeah.
But you could tell everybody was scared, but you could tell that there were people trying to stay calm, because there were a lot of kids. There was a lot of old people that couldn't move real fast, too.
Yeah.
This rings true. The interesting, it's very sad as well. It was definitely a premeditated event, though, because it takes a few days for concrete to set. So somebody thought this through, and it was pretty well organized. The fact that we have buses, logistics, and the pictures are gone. There are pictures of buses that were lined up, and I can't find them on the internet anymore. They were gray buses. She describes the same color. And this kind of it just unveils the brutality of the Antifa portion of the attack, which there's no way around reaching the conclusion that it probably was prearranged. What's your feeling on this one, Cindy or Don?
I'm kind of overwhelmed. I had not watched that video before, and again, we're used to seeing things on TV and in movies. We've become very accustomed to seeing that kind of thing. But when I'm sure, and I've never even been in a bar where there was a bar fight, but I have no doubt that actually being in one of these situations is very different from seeing it on a screen, and probably very few people are prepared for an event like this.
At this point, just at about 11 o'clock, there was a simultaneous revocation of the permit, and the police withdrawal occurred around this time, and the area turned into it was not a healthy situation for anybody. They had removed some of the blockades from the roads. I don't know if that's traced to the helicopter crash, which is another aspect that's not talked about as much, but there were 2 fatalities in the Virginia State Police of a helicopter that was monitoring the scene. And they might have lost touch with the traffic flow that led to the next portion of this. But you can see Jason Kessler being led away. And basically I think he's responsible for all this mayhem, really. The death of 3 people. And for what reason, it's hard to tell. We all talk about her name is Heather Heyer. When I was in Charlottesville, I was able to talk to people who actually knew her, and it was also corroborated in the Charles Patrick video that we just saw, that she actually was in favor of keeping the monuments, but was not. I don't think anybody here is a racist either, but she was not happy with the invasion from the outside. And this is what this was. When I was there, it was one of the most peaceful scenes. They have a main street there that's kind of a closed walking campus, and these other streets, the street where she met her death, is actually referred to by the people as an alley, and it literally is an alley. It's only, picture this, the street itself, a little hard to tell. We'll move to one thing on this photo, though, is you can see that let's just go back for just a second, Cindy, and see how the media decided not to use the real image of her last brave stand they go back to scrub that image and pick up something that's better suited for television. But that's Heather on the right. This is who she was, and very well respected. There were a number of people that knew her personally, and she was in the restaurant. That's covered in the Charles Patrick interview. A very tight community, and all this trouble came from outside. There was no hint of trouble when I was there the weekend after. It was just like a hurricane had come through, and the people were walking around in a daze. The next photo is, and there'll be more if we do another show on this, is some of the original photography that I was able to collect. And I was particularly interested in the road. I just had a feeling that there was something else going on with this scene when I saw the video at home. And it's basically a death trap. There's no other way to say it. It's a 4-degree grade. It's a downhill slope. It's only 31.5 feet wide. We measured the whole thing. I had a person working with me, photographer, and that's 10, if you watch a football game, it's a little over 10 yards wide. And not only that, there were other cars parked along that sidewalk, further restricting. The crowd had to move up through that, and the driver, James Fields, was attempting to get out of town. They actually shut down all the transportation after the state of emergency for the larger vehicles that were taking the Nazis around. And he definitely had aggressive intent. There's no way around it. He was driving recklessly. Although it is difficult to drive downhill, that's no excuse. He should have just turned his car off and walked away, but didn't do that. And Heather was hit near the bottom of this hill. And there's the next frame. There's some silly theories around that she died of a heart attack. That's all nonsense. It was proven in court, and it's proven here. She's directly in the path of the car. This is right before she was picked up. She was carried on the hood. There were 2 cars parked at the end of the alley. They do call it an alley. They were idling in the road and probably were not visible to the driver, but nevertheless, no excuse. The crowd parted in front of him and revealed these 2 cars, which he smashed into. Heather was ejected from the hood, fell backwards, and sustained a massive chest injury from the backwards fall, and was never revived. And the official cause of death is cardiac arrest, but the cause of death is never auto accident. And chest trauma also was a contributing factor. The reflections on this, again, is just a chaotic situation, a road that should not have had traffic on it. And I'm still wondering, there were lots of barricades around when I was there. They definitely had the police, for whatever reason, they pulled back. Had they blockaded this road, there wouldn't have been a fatality. It was just not a road that should have had any traffic on it in a state of emergency, and with crowds walking around. Not only that, but with fights breaking out sporadically all around this whole area. It was just very irresponsible. One can't say that they wanted this to happen, but it definitely was a case of malfeasance, and I'm kind of surprised there aren't more lawsuits. There were numerous injuries. The assailant was convicted of manslaughter. He's facing federal charges and will likely spend his life in prison. And I think the injury count was around 20, and serious injuries, mostly from the backing up. He backed up. Most people have seen the video. We're not going to show it today, of him backing up and out of the crowd, and then was taken into custody shortly after that. And reflections, either Don or Cindy, on this tragedy?
Well, I wanted to back up just a bit because I meant to comment on this, the fact that the police withdrew, and then that's when the troubles began, that there was some order that was given, and that happened. And when the 2 sides were at that point able to get at each other, and this animosity had been stirred up, and then the police withdraw, that, to me, that's very suspicious. I had also remember similar kind of police action happening around the whole Ferguson riot events that happened prior to this, and much earlier. And it's a similar tactic that people have got to wonder, how could something like that happen? Why would the police withdraw? And then I guess the cover story is that it's too dangerous for the police to intervene when people are getting violent. But actually, that's what led to the escalation of violence, was the removal of the police force. So to me, that's just very suspicious. I'm not sure exactly what mechanisms would be involved to cause the police to act in such a way, but
well, I don't think it's
just highly suspicious.
McAuliffe. It was the VSP. You'll see it on the helmets, Virginia State Police, and they're under the control of the governor. And I guess we'll never know. But it seems to me that whatever prompted that decision, it might have been they were shaken up from the crash of the helicopter. Two fatalities in the VSP from that incident, and we'll never know. But it was, at one point there were actually attempts to mix the crowd before this. It was going on. They were actually penned in. It was almost worse before they withdrew. They were not letting people out of the barricades. And if people want to listen to the rest of that interview, it gets much worse than the little clip we played. And they were the normal civilians in that area who weren't on either side were penned into that area with all this fighting going on for a very long time. It was hard for them to get out. It's a horrific story to listen to her account, and I do believe it. The credibility of that witness seems very high. The aftermath of what we call the Charlottesville riot and how it impacted Donald Trump was just really the main subject of today's broadcast. It's taken us a while to get there, but the setup is important. I think it was a very confusing situation to the president, and it certainly has been to most people. And there were three statements. The first one was, we won't play the first two, but it was outside his vacation home in Bedminster, New Jersey, I think, on the 12th, same day, about 2 hours after the fatality. And he made I think it was a written statement on 8/14. But the key one, the one that has received the most attention, is the one that occurred at Trump Tower on the 15th of August, 2017. And it was actually, the subject was not Charlottesville. It was a economic conference. I believe it was taking place at Trump Tower. And the press, of course, took the opportunity to really lay into him about Charlottesville, to drive home the narrative that appears to have been kind of set up here with these two extremist groups that have very murky origins.
I mean, ask him how he's doing. I do it the same way, and you know why? Because I want to make sure, when I make a statement, that the statement is correct. And there was no way of making a correct statement that early. I had to see the facts, unlike a lot of reporters. I didn't know David Duke was there. I wanted to see the facts. And the facts, as they started coming out, were very well stated. In fact, everybody said his statement was beautiful. If he would have made it sooner, that would have been good. I couldn't have made it sooner because I didn't know all of the facts. Frankly, people still don't know all of the facts. It was very important. Excuse me. It was very important to me to get the facts out, and correctly, because if I would have made a fast statement, and the first statement was made without knowing much other than what we were seeing. The second statement was made after, with knowledge, with great knowledge. There's still things that people don't know. I want to make a statement with knowledge. I wanted to know the facts. Okay.
Two questions. Was this terrorism? And can you tell us how you're feeling about your chief strategist?
Well, I think the driver of the car is a disgrace to himself, his family, and this country. And that is, you can call it terrorism. You can call it murder. You can call it whatever you want. I would just call it as the fastest one to come up with a good verdict. That's what I'd call it. Because there is a question. Is it murder? Is it terrorism? And then you get into legal semantics. The driver of the car is a murderer. And what he did was a horrible, horrible, inexcusable thing.
Can you tell us how you're feeling about your chief strategist, Mr. Bannon? Can you talk about that?
I would echo Maggie's question. Steve Bannon is...
I never spoke to Mr. Bannon about it.
Can you tell us broadly what do you still have confidence in
Well,
Steve?
we'll see. Hey, look, I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that, and I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. But he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
Do you have confidence that Senator McCain has called on you to defend your National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, against some of these attacks?
I did it the last time.
And he called on it again, linking this
Senator McCain?
to the alt-right. And
Senator McCain, you mean the one who voted against Obamacare?
And he said
Who is Senator? You mean Senator McCain who voted against us getting good health care?
McCain said that the alt-right is behind these attacks, and he linked that same group to those who perpetrated the attack in Charlottesville.
Well, I don't know. I can't tell you. I'm sure Senator McCain must know what he's talking about. But when you say the alt-right, define alt-right to me. You define it. Go ahead.
Well, I'm saying,
define it for me. Come on, let's go. Define
Senator
it for me.
McCain defined them as the same group.
Okay, what about the alt-left that came charging at him? Excuse me. What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
This is Senator McCain's statement.
Let me ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do. So, as far as I'm concerned, that was a horrible, horrible day. Wait a minute. I'm not finished. I'm not finished, fake news. That was a horrible day. I will tell you something. I watched those very closely, much more closely than you people watched it. And you have you had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. And nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now. You had a group on the other side that came charging in without a permit, and they were very, very violent. Go ahead.
Do you think that what you call the alt-left is the same as neo-Nazis?
All of those people, excuse me, I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. Those people were also there because they wanted to protest the taking down of a statue, Robert E. Lee. So, excuse me, and you take a look at some of the groups and you see, and you know it if you were honest reporters, which in many cases you're not, but many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop? But they were there to protest, excuse me, you take a look the night before, they were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. Infrastructure question, go ahead.
Should statues of Robert E. Lee stay up?
I would say that's up to a local town, community, or the federal government, depending on where it is located.
Are you against the Confederacy? How concerned are you about race relations in America? And do you think things have gotten worse or better since you took office?
I think they've gotten better or the same. Look, they've been frayed for a long time. And you can ask President Obama about that because he'd make speeches about it. But I believe that the fact that I've brought in, it will be soon, millions of jobs. You see where companies are moving back into our country. I think that's going to have a tremendous positive impact on race relations. We have companies coming back into our country. We have 2 car companies that just announced. We have Foxconn in Wisconsin just announced. We have many companies, I say, back into the country. I think that's going to have a huge positive impact on race relations. You know why? It's jobs. What people want now, they want jobs. They want great jobs with good pay. And when they have that, you watch how race relations will be. And I'll tell you, we're spending a lot of money on the inner cities. We're fixing the inner cities. We're doing far more than anybody's done with respect to the inner cities. It's a priority for me, and it's very important.
Mr. President, are you putting what you're calling the alt-left and white supremacists on the same moral plane?
I'm not putting anybody on a moral plane. What I'm saying is this. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is.
On both sides, sir, you said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Kill the person. Heather hired Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as you. And you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group. Excuse me. I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue, and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
Robert E. Lee are not the same.
Well, no, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now, we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture. And you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Unfairly, sir. I'm sorry. I just didn't understand what you were saying. You were saying the press has treated white nationalists unfairly?
No,
I just didn't understand what you were saying.
No. There were people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. I'm sure in that group there were some bad ones. The following day, it looked like they had some rough, bad people, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them. But you had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest, and very legally protest, because, you know, I don't know if you know, they had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit. So I only tell you this. There are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country, a horrible moment. But there are two sides to the country. Does anybody have a final?
What do you think, Don? Or Cindy?
I think that was he handled a tough crowd pretty well. And if indeed this event was a setup, as it seems there are a lot of indications that it may well have been, this press conference with the president was the number 2 punch of the 1-2 punch. I mean, not to make light of the day and the events and the horrible things that happened, but again, if it was a contrivance, humiliating the president and trying to make it appear that he had an affiliation with the violent people at this event, was a part of the plan. I mean, this was probably intended to be the climax. He handled it well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I thought the most telling moment in that whole segment was, because I was familiar with the president's rebuttal of the excuse me, we've got bad people on both sides, and that whole scenario, so that that really he's already answered the issues. There was a reporter that said, I'm confused. Are you saying that there were good white nationalists? And the very fact that she was answering that question after President Trump clearly explained that he was not talking about the white nationalists as being good people, that really showed the bias of the press in that singular moment. And it really showed that this was an attempt at a setup and a frame job by the Trump hating press. And not all the press hates Trump, but there certainly is a faction that does.
I think it's a sign that President Trump is a business person, and most of the time in that field, if you're in a discussion or a meeting, your knowledge is assumed to be accumulating, and you normally don't have to repeat this. Repeating the same thing twice is considered to be just bad etiquette, a waste of time. And I think the president, unfortunately, sometimes assumes that he's in a business meeting, and if he's already covered that topic, they'll remember it in the context that their next comment may be presented. But what the press is doing here is really engaging in ankle biting. It's like when a 6-inch terrier starts chasing you around, and they just kept working them over. This is a 53-minute press conference in a cavernous area that probably wasn't that comfortable. Audio, acoustically, you could hear some of the sound mixing was a bit of a problem, and they got him. Eventually they were able to take that 53 minutes and take out 20 seconds, which is a tiny fraction of the total. They were looking for it, and I think the John McCain comment was a big tell. And I think I don't think there's a plot to do this as much as just sort of a subconscious or intuitive, they see something happening and they just know, well, I'm supposed to jump on this bandwagon over here. It's just a political instinct. So you can see McCain bringing out the alt-right, kind of putting the icing on this alt-right framing cake that this event was supposed to accomplish, and it probably did accomplish it. At least we're trying to break it down now, but hopefully people can listen to a 1-hour plus podcast. In this day and age, it's hard to get people to slow down and really pay attention, and they're in the soundbite encapsulated media frame that we get on network television. It's just not going to come through, especially when you already don't like a president or don't like a public figure. You're going to look for confirmation bias.
Yeah, and certainly what you began by saying that Kessler's aim has been to, as you said, dirty up a politician. If indeed this was an attempt at that, then the outcome they would have hoped the most for would have been for the president to be completely humiliated, which I don't believe he was, but just because of his skill in communicating and handling aggressive people who don't like him.
Right. One of the other things to focus on here, since this has been over a year since this event happened, was what in terms of looking at the fruit of President Trump as it relates to the Charlottesville event and his poll ratings among certain groups, what we actually find is that the president's approval ratings have gone increasingly higher among the blacks, or the people that might have been through this event and other similar framings have been taught to dislike the president. It's actually gone in the opposite direction. There are more African American Trump supporters than there were previously. So if this was an attempt to hit President Trump and his approval ratings among the African American, typically the Democrat constituents, it has actually done the opposite, or it has not had as strong an effect as the people that were trying to use this as a framing event might have hoped.
In wishful thinking, when you really think about it, let's accept the premise that President Trump was saying there were good people on both sides. I guess that would mean that would also include Antifa. So it's just a nonsensical conclusion that he would even entertain. The thought of supporting Antifa makes no sense either. So
yeah, it doesn't.
That's part of the problem is people aren't really thinking this through. And I think people that are able to step back and just use common sense and not put their feelings first. There's some MBTI stuff going on here. President Trump is a sensing type, and he needs to see the physical evidence. He's not going to try to use his intuition about what's going on. He needs to see the source film, study the hard object itself, look at the actual, what he would call the fact. A fact to President Trump is the sense, is the physical evidence, and then the thinking function follows that. So he's going to take his time to collect sense data and then go from there. But the problem is he's talking to a group of people that are working on the opposite polarity, and they're imagining, prejudging, looking into the future, and projecting motives into the situation, and then they're using value judgments instead of the thinking function to lead that process. And you're still going to come away with disagreement, I think, on this issue for almost forever. I don't think it'll ever stop. If most people can't even watch Donald Trump, at least in this region, for more than a few minutes anyway. They've effectively slimed his image on television to the point where it's considered a noxious stimulus. And I've experienced this firsthand. I don't know if I could sit anybody down, and even in my family, and have them watch 10 minutes of Donald Trump and really, approach it in an objective way. And it's kind of sad, really. It's a divisive. This is where the press has really been the divisive force. It's not about Donald Trump. It's not about any politician. It's about the subtext that is kind of built into this subterranean world of influencing that these people are engaging in.
Yeah, one of the big and you could see, having it been over a year now since this event happened, it was interesting to watch that clip again and to see how often President Trump referred to fake news and other comments like that, where he had such an adversarial press. I actually think it's gotten somewhat better since then, because, of course, this was a very adversarial event. It kind of set it up that way. But the underlying, I think, implication of that press conference in particular was that if you buy into our emotional narrative, we'll stop attacking you. And it's almost a form of emotional blackmail. It's hard for me not to see it that way, that President Trump did actually stand against the attempt to emotionally blackmail him.
Right.
I can kind of see, because in the Enneagram, President Trump is almost certainly a 3. And I'm a 2, so they're both a heart type. Heart types don't like to be disliked or ill thought of, and that's a generalization, but it holds fairly true. And he, while being firm, he goes a distance in trying to be liked. He wants people to like him. And what he said about there being good intentions on both sides, we don't know for certain that nobody on the Antifa side has good intentions. And I'm thinking about Paul the Apostle in the book of Acts, who was murdering Christians, was fully responsible for persecuting Christians who were being put to death for their faith. And he had an experience that completely changed him. And sometimes we're so stuck in our perspective that we might have good intentions and do something very wrong because we can't get outside of our own paradigm. And I would hope as time continues to go ahead, and as we face the kind of division in our country that we have, I would hope that we are all willing to kind of re-examine our paradigms, our opinions, however you want to phrase it. And possibly if we are wrong about something, if we're proven wrong, I hope that we're able to adjust it. And I would hope that, maybe as some of these Antifa people grow older, whatever, they go back and watch some of these videos and see the impact that their actions actually had on real people. I'd love for, maybe some of the people who stormed the front of that restaurant to listen to the account of the lady who had to run out the back. We're all human beings, and ultimately I hope that we can find common ground. And there are obviously, I believe, people who have malintent. Hopefully there's a way that we can separate them from the rest of, it's intended to be able to do that with prisons. Obviously that's not effective because of our justice system, but I think most people do, many people do have good intentions.
Well said.
I really agreed with Cindy's analysis, and I just had one more thought to tag on to it, and that's that in that press conference with President Trump acting out of his role as a 3 and standing his ground there, I believe what you had in the Enneagram position of the press was a collective 6 pack going into stress mode and getting aggressive and taking on the 3, attempting to fight him on his own ground, moving to 3 in stress. I'm not completely sold on that, but it's an idea that occurs to me, and I think that might be what actually occurred there in Enneagram terms.
And maybe the refusal to kind of knuckle under to the value judgment was just more of an allegiance to factual truth about a situation, and he would look at that as a weakness to cave in. He would look at that as, I don't know if there's an Enneagram equivalent, but it's sort of like an INTJ's aversion to dishonest factual representation.
Well, Ken, thank you for gathering this information. And is there much more that we want to say?
You said it all there, Cindy, with your last statement. It was very enlightening.
We'll close with an image of Heather. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. That's a quote from Heather. And we also want to acknowledge and remember the Trooper Bates, Lieutenant Cullen and Trooper Bates, who also lost their lives. And if someone was trying to make a political statement, they didn't care if lives were lost, that's pretty cold. And I suppose you could say that all wars are that very thing. But we would hope that in our country we will be able to move into some kind of a new era that's beyond this kind of violence and the kind of thirst for power and control that causes people to commit these kind of acts of violence. So, to the curious, the seekers, and the experts, we thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. Please like this video if you have indeed enjoyed it. We hope that you have, and we would ask you to subscribe to our channel so that you are able to catch our future episodes. And once again, thank you for joining us, and God bless America.